Happy Friday. And the only reason I know it's Friday is because I'm not reading poetry today. But I'm going to very quickly go over something you love. I brought this to your an historic book that is actually in the rare books collection. And I'm going to put it right back where I found it. But I just wanted to share a few things with you. And if any of you didn't hear last Friday, this opening page of the book, it's called Marriage and Parentage, and the Sanitary and Physiological Laws for the Production of Children of Finer Health and Greater Ability. It is written by a physician, and get this, and sanitarian. The virtues of men and women, as well as their vices, may descend to their children. There are so many quips and quotes that relate to the Edith Wharton that I'm going to be sharing with you. And very briefly, because I want to get to the Edith Wharton story, it says, this is just a very short paragraph, without the capacity to enjoy life, no man can be wealthy. No kind of good appetite can be bought with money. And the man who has not a good appetite, for healthy work and wholesome food, is a poor man. A dead man owns nothing. A sick man owns little. A healthy man, healthy in the widest sense of the term, owns all that is possible for mortal man to own. Oh, you're going to find so many words of wisdom in this book. Please, as you walk up the stairs to the second floor, don't turn left, don't turn right, walk straight ahead. This is one of the many treasures that waits for you dead ahead. And now, since I referenced wealthy, this particular book Donna just ordered in, The New York Stories of Edith Wharton, selected and with an introduction by Roxana Robinson. There are some 20 marvelous stories, and I've just picked one. There's one in there that's just too long to read. You love it. Let me see if I can find the name of it, because I don't. Oh, it's easy. Roman Fever. You have got to read that story. It's brilliant. Now, catch up for people who did not listen in the first segment. I've separated this into three parts. A man named Anson Warley is rich. Notice the reference to rich in the little previous book I read to you, that's from the 1880s. His valet is Fillmore, and his passion is being entertained by various people in their dinners and balls and everything that's, as the French would say, comme il faut, done as it should be done. And one of the quotes that comes out of the previous bit that I read that I just dearly love, this whole beginning is two older men, the valet and Fillmore, who is his name, and Anson Warley. And he says, this is what I've already read to you, but it's worth repeating so we can bring us back on track. True. And this is from a message he's gotten from Mrs. Jaspar. Is the truth what she wants? Oh, all right. Then the next time I get a Mrs. Jaspar requests the pleasure, I'll answer it with a Mr. Warley declines the boredom. Think she'll understand that, eh? And the phrase became a catchword in his little set. that winter. Now, I continue. Certainly, I shall not stay at home tonight. Why, what's wrong with me? He snapped, swinging around on Fillmore. The valet's face grew longer. His way of answering such questions was always to pull out his face. It was his only means of putting any expression into it. He turned away into the bedroom, and Warley sat alone by his library fire. Now, what did the man see that was wrong with him, he wondered. He had felt a little confusion that morning when he was doing his daily sprint around the park. His exercise was reduced to that, but it had been only a passing flurry, of which Fillmore could, of course, know nothing. And as soon as it was over, his mind had seemed more lucid, his eye keener than ever, and sometimes he reflected the electric light in his library lamps would blaze up too brightly after a break in the current. And he would say to himself, wincing a little at the sudden glare on the page he was reading, that means it'll go out in a minute. Yes, his mind, at that moment, had been quite piercingly clear and perceptive. His eye had passed with a renovating glitter over every detail of the daily scene. He stood still for a minute under the leafless trees of the mall and, looking about him with the sudden insight of age, understood that he had reached the time of life when Alps and cathedrals become as transient as flowers. Everything was fleeting. Fleeting? Yes, that was what had given him the vertigo. The doctors, poor fools, called it the stomach or high blood pressure. But it was only the dizzy plunge of the sands in the hourglass, the everlasting plunge that emptied one of heart and bowels like the of an elevator from the top floor of a skyscraper. Certainly, after that moment of revelation, he had felt a little more tired than usual for the rest of the day. The light had flagged in his mind as it sometimes did in his lamps. At Chrissy Torrance's, where he had lunched, they had accused him of being silent. His hostess had said that he looked pale, but he retorted with a joke and thrown himself into the talk with a feverish loquacity. It was the only thing to do, for he could not tell all these people at lunch table that very morning he had arrived at the turn in the path from which mountains look as transient as flowers, and that one after another, they would all arrive there too. He leaned his head back and closed his eyes, but not in sleep. He did not feel sleepy, but keyed up and alert. In the next room, he heard Fillmore reluctantly, protestingly laying out his evening clothes. He had no fear about the dinner tonight. A quiet, intimate little affair at an old friend's house, just 2 or 3 congenial men and Elfman, the pianist, who probably would play, and that lovely Elfrida Flight. You know, the fact that people asked him to dine to meet Elfrida Flight seemed to prove pretty conclusively that he was still in the running. He chuckled softly at Fillmore's pessimism and thought, well, after all, I suppose no man seems young to his valet. Time to dress very soon, he thought, and luxuriously postponed getting up out of the chair. Section 3. We just finished 2, and we did 1 before. Different cast of characters. She's worse than usual tonight, said the day nurse, laying down the evening paper as her colleague joined her. Absolutely determined to have her jewels out. Now the night nurse, fresh from a long sleep and an afternoon at the movies with a gentleman friend, threw down her fancy bag, tossed off her hat, rumpled up her hair before old Mrs. Jaspar's tall toilet mirror. Oh, I'll settle that, don't you worry, she said brightly. Now, don't you fret her, Miss Cress, said the other, getting wearily out of her chair. We're very well off here. Take it as a whole, and I don't want her pressure rushed up for nothing. Miss Cress, still looking at herself in the glass, smiled reassuringly at Miss Dunn's pale reflection behind her. She and Miss Dunn got on very well together and knew on which side their bread was buttered. But at the end of the day, Miss Dunn was always fagged out and fearing the worst. The patient wasn't as hard to handle as all that. Oh, just let her ring for her old maid. Old Lavinia. And say, my sapphire velvet tonight with the diamond stars, and Lavinia would know exactly how to manage her. Miss Dunn had put on her hat and coat and crammed her knitting and the newspaper into her bag, which, unlike Miss Cress's, was capacious and shabby. But she still loitered undecided on the threshold. I could stay with you till 10. She looked almost reluctantly about the high-studded dressing room. Everything in the house was high-studded, with its rich, dusky carpet and curtains, and its monumental dressing table draped with lace and laden with gold-backed brushes and combs, gold-stoppered toilet bottles, and all the charming paraphernalia of beauty at her glass. Old Lavinia even renewed every morning the roses and carnations in the slim crystal vases between the powder boxes and the nail polishers. Now, since the family had shut down the hothouses at the uninhabited country place on the Hudson, Miss Cruz suspected that old Lavinia bought these flowers out of her own pocket. Cold out tonight? Queried Miss Dunn from the door. Fierce, regular blizzard at the corners. Say, shall I lend you my fur scarf? Miss Cress, pleased with the memory of her afternoon, oh, they'd be engaged soon, she thought, and with the drowsy prospect of an evening in a deep armchair near the warm gleam of the dressing-room fire, was disposed to kindliness toward that poor, thin, dun girl who supported her mother and her brother's idiot twins. And she wanted Miss Dunn to notice her new fur. My, isn't it too lovely? No, not for worlds. Oh, no, thank you. Her hands on the doorknob, Miss Dunn repeated, "Don't you cross her now," and was gone. Lavinia's bell rang furiously twice. Then the door between the dressing room and Mrs. Jaspar's bedroom opened, and Mrs. Jaspar herself entered. "Lavinia!" she called in a high, irritated voice. Then, seeing the nurse, who had slipped into her print dress and starched cap, she added in a lower tone, "Oh, Miss Lemoyne, good evening." Her first nurse, it appeared, had been called Miss Lemoyne, and she gave the same name to all the others, quite unaware that there had been any changes at all in the staff. "I heard talking and carriages driving up. Have people begun to arrive?" she asked nervously. "Where is Lavinia? I still have my jewels to put on." She stood before the nurse, the same petrifying apparition which always, at this hour, struck Miss Cress to silence. Mrs. Jaspar was tall. She had been broad, and her bones remained impressive, though the flesh had withered on them. Lavinia had encased her, as usual, in the low-necked purple velvet dress, nipped in at the waist in the old-fashioned way, expanding in voluminous folds about the hips and flowing in a long train over the darker velvet of the carpet. Mrs. Jaspar's swollen feet could no longer be pushed into the high-heeled satin slippers which went with the dress, but her skirts were so long and spreading that, by taking short steps, she managed, so Lavinia daily assured her, entirely to conceal the broad, round tips of her black orthopedic shoes. "Your jewels, Mrs. Jaspar? You've got them on," said Miss Cress brightly. Mrs. Jaspar turned her face to Miss Cress and looked at her with a glassy, incredulous gaze. Her eyes, Miss Cress thought, were the worst. She lifted one old hand, veined and knobbed as a raised map, to her elaborate purple-black wig, groped among the puffs and curls and undulations. Queer, Miss Cress thought, that it never occurred to her to look into the glass, and after an interval affirmed, "You must be mistaken, my dear. Don't you think you ought to have your eyes examined?" The door opened again, and a very old woman, so old as to make Mrs. Jaspar appear almost young, hobbled in with a sidelong step. "Excuse me, madam, I was downstairs when the bell rang." Lavinia had probably always been small and slight. Now, beside her towering mistress, she looked a mere feather, a straw. Everything about her had dried, contracted, even been volatilized into nothingness, except her watchful gray eyes. eyes, in which intelligence and comprehension burned like two fixed stars. "Do excuse me, madame," she repeated. Mrs. Jaspar looked at her despairingly. "I hear carriages driving up, and Miss Lemoyne says I have my jewels on, and I know I haven't." "With that lovely necklace?" Miss Cress ejaculated. Mrs. Jaspar's hand twisted, rose again, and this time to her denuded shoulders, which were as stark and barren as the rock from which the hand might have broken. She felt, and tears rose to her eyes. "Oh, why do you lie to me?" she burst out passionately. Lavinia softly intervened. "Miss Lemoyne meant how lovely you'll be when you get the necklace on, madame." "Diamonds, diamonds," said Mrs. Jaspar with an awful smile. "Of course, madame." Down at the dressing table, and Lavinia, with eager, random hands, began to adjust the poignets about her mistress's shoulders, and to repair the havoc wrought in the purple-black wig by its wearers, groping for her tiara. "Now, you do look lovely, madame," she sighed. Mrs. Jaspar was on her feet again, stiff but incredibly active. "Like a cat she is," Miss Cress used to relate. "I do hear carriages. Or is it an automobile? Now, the McGraws, I know, have one of those newfangled automobiles. And now I hear the front door opening. Oh, quick, Lavinia, my fan, my gloves, my handkerchief. Now, how often have I got to tell you? I used to have the perfect maid." Lavinia's eyes brimmed. "That were me, madame," she said, bending to straighten out the folds of the long purple velvet train. "You know, to watch the two of them," Miss Cruz used to tell a circle of appreciative friends, "is a lot better than any circus." Mrs. Jaspar paid no attention. She twitched the train out of Lavinia's vacillating hold, swept to the door, and then paused, as if stopped by a jerk of her constricted muscles. "Oh, but my diamonds, you cruel woman, you're letting me go down without my diamonds?" Her ruined face puckered up in a grimace like a newborn baby's, and she began to sob despairingly. Everybody's against me," she wept into her powerless misery. Lavinia helped herself to her feet and tottered across the floor. It was almost more than she could bear to see her mistress in distress. Madame, if you'll just wait till they're gone out of the safe," she entreated. The woman she saw before her, the woman she was entreating and consoling, was not the old petrified Mrs. Jaspar, with the face and wig awry, whom Miss Cress stood watching with a smile, but a young, proud creature, commanding and splendid in her Paris gown of amber moire, who years ago had burst into just such furious sobs because, as she was sweeping down to receive her guests, the doctor had told her that little Grace, with whom she had been playing all afternoon, had a sick throat and no Oh, everyone's against me. Everybody, she had sobbed in her fury. And the young Lavinia, stricken by such Olympian anger, had stood speechless, longing to confront her and secretly indignant with little Grace and the doctor. If you'll just wait, madame, while I go down and ask Munson to open the safe. Oh, there's no one come yet, I do assure you. Munson was the old butler, the only person who knew the combination of the safe in Mrs. Jaspar's bedroom. Lavinia had known it once, too, but now she was no longer able to remember it. The worst of it was that she feared lest Munson, who had been spending the day in the Bronx, might not have returned. Munson was growing old, too, and he did sometimes forget about these dinner parties of Mrs. Jaspar's, and then the stupid footman, George, had to announce the names, and you couldn't be sure that Mrs. Jaspar wouldn't notice Munson's absence and be excited and angry. These dinner party nights were killing old Lavinia, and she did so want to keep alive. She wanted to live long enough to wait on Mrs. Jaspar to the last. She disappeared, and Miss Cress poked up the fire and persuaded Mrs. Jaspar to sit down in an armchair and tell her who was coming. It always amused Mrs. Jaspar to say over the long list of a guest's name, and generally she remembered them fairly well, for they were always the same. The last people, Lavinia and Munson said, who had dined at the house on the very night before her stroke. With recovered complacency, she began, counting over one after the other on her ring-laden fingers. The Italian ambassador, the bishop, Mr. and Mrs. Torrington Bligh, Mr. and Mrs. Fred Ainsworth, Mr. and Mrs. Mitchell McGraw, Mr. and Mrs. Torrington Bligh. Oh, you've said them before, Miss Cress interpolated, getting out her fancy knitting. Oh, a necktie for her friend, and beginning to count the stitches. And Mrs. Jaspar, distressed and bewildered by the interruption, had to repeat over and over, Torrington Bligh, until the connection was re-established, and she went on again swimmingly with Mr. and Mrs. Fred Ainsworth, Mr. and Mrs. Mitchell McGraw, Miss Laura Ladue, Mr. Harold Ladue, Mr. and Mrs. Benjamin Bronx, Mr. and Mrs. Torrington Bligh. Oh, no. I mean, Mr. Anson Warley. Yes, Mr. Anson Warley. That's it, she added complacently. Miss Cress smiled and interrupted her counting. Oh, no, that's not it. What do you mean, my dear? Not it? Mr. Anson Warley, he's not coming. Mrs. Jaspar's jaw fell, and she stared at the nurse's coldly smiling face. Not coming? No, he's not coming. He's not on the list. Oh, that old list. As if Miss Cress didn't know it by heart. Everybody in the house did, except the booby George, who heard it reeled off every other night by Munson, and who was always stumbling over names to refer to the written page. Not on the list, Mrs. Jaspar gasped. Miss Cress, her pretty head Signs of uneasiness gathered on Mrs. Jaspar's face, and her lips began to tremble. It always amused Miss Cress to give her these little jolts, though she knew Miss Dunn and the doctors didn't approve of her doing so. She knew also that it was against her own interests, and she did try to bear in mind Miss Dunn's oft-repeated admonition about not sending up the patient's blood pressure. But when she was in high spirits, as she was tonight, they would certainly be engaged. It was irresistible to get a rise out of the old lady, and she thought it funny, this new figure unexpectedly appearing among those time-worn guests. I wonder what the rest of 'em will say to him, she giggled. Now, we are going to conclude the story next week, and we might run over a little bit because I'm trying to keep to our schedule. But now do remember something. I told you what Anson Warley said about getting invitations to dinners and how he always just refused them, especially when they came from her. But all of a sudden, he's accepted one. And that quote that I read you, which was from the very first reading session, is it the truth she wants? All right. Next time I get a Mrs. Jaspar requests the pleasure, I'll answer with a Mr. Warley declines the boredom. Think she'll understand that, eh? And the phrase became a catchword in his little set that winter. And so, next week, let's find out about this dinner. Till then, have a wonderful weekend. And don't accept any invitations you don't mean to honor. Edith Wharton will write about it.